All right, thank you so much for joining us on ONLA Webinars. We have a great webinar for you today. Weed Control Basics with Steve Larson. So enjoy. Thank you so much for being with us. Steve?
Thank you so much, Summer. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate all of you being able to join us this morning. I'd much rather be seeing your faces. In fact, I don't see any faces other than Summer's, which is a nice face, don't get me wrong. But I'd love to see all of your faces in person, and hopefully by next year we'll be able to do that. As Summer said, my name is Steve Larson. I'm an ornamental specialist for Bayer. And what does that mean? An ornamental specialist. I cover the nursery and the greenhouse markets for Bayer. I have a fairly large territory. I cover about 1/4 of the geography of the United States, going from Texas, Oklahoma, all the way over to Southern California. And I concentrate most of my activity on commercial nurseries and commercial greenhouses. So I want to be speaking to weed control for those two markets, but I also know that we're going to have some landscapers in the audience today. And a lot of the principles that we apply to a nursery setting, for example, since we're dealing with ornamentals, really apply to weed control basics in the landscape as well. So I'll be sure to try to pull you guys in as we go through the conversation here today. And by all means, if you have some questions, I definitely want to be able to address those, whether it's for the greenhouse, the nursery, or the landscape market. And we will do that as we get to the end of the presentation. Now, one of the things I'm going to talk to you about with regards to weed control basics is preventive weed control. And it's a very important component to your overall strategy, is that we try to prevent weeds. One of the main ways and one of the main technologies that we use in preventing weeds are pre-emergence herbicides. Those are herbicides that we spray out to create a barrier on the surface of the soil, so that when germinating weed seeds grow up through that barrier, it encounters the herbicide and it kills the seedlings. So you're going to hear me refer to pre-emergence herbicides quite a bit today, and I'll get into that and all those details as we move along. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I hope all of you can see the next slide here. Summer, I'll just ask you to shake your head, or if you can see a screen that's white with "Why is weed control important?" So it looks like that slide is up. So that's the last time I'll ask that question. Why is weed control important? Well, it's important because weeds are expensive. They cost a lot of money. And believe it or not, if you're a nursery grower especially, and perhaps even on the landscape side, when you talk about the different chemistries that you use to control pests, herbicides are the #1 pest management cost in terms of chemical costs, representing about nationwide about 50% of the overall cost when it comes to managing pests overall. And you throw in labor into that for hand weeding, and hand weeding, unfortunately, is a reality when it comes to weed control. The key to hand weeding is that we want to reduce hand weeding as much as we can with our chemistry applications, because by doing so, we reduce labor costs. But still, you're going to have some hand weeding costs, and you add that in to the total number of what you're spending on weed control, and those expenses can be quite significant. I don't need to tell anybody right now, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic experience that we're going through right now, that labor is not getting any cheaper, nor is it getting any more plentiful. If anything, labor has become much more of a challenge in our industry, and certainly the costs of labor are continuing to go up. So anything that we can do to manage labor costs are certainly a very good thing, and we'll want to try to limit those costs or reduce those costs as much as we can. Obviously, weeds are an eyesore. You know, they're aesthetically not very pretty, especially if you're trying to make an impression with a landscape or trying to sell plant materials in a nursery. But they're certainly more than just an eyesore. Existing weeds propagate and spread very quickly, so we know that a lot of the annual weeds that we deal with in our industry go to seed very quickly, and they can propagate and spread all over the place before we know it. But believe it or not, weeds are also important hosts of different disease pathogens. I know in particular rust diseases, powdery mildews, all find different types of weeds as hosts, and they can certainly sporulate and send those spores over to the ornamental crops that we're growing unsuspectingly. But maybe one of the biggest challenges with weeds is the fact that they harbor insect pests. A number of weeds have thrips, mites, whiteflies. I probably should have thrown aphids on here. And that can become a real problem in terms of a host for a pest that can find its way onto our crop. And so we need to control weeds for more than just the concept that they're an eyesore or aesthetically unpleasing, because they can propagate, they can harbor pests, they can host, harbor disease pathogens, and they can host insect pests. And we want to make sure that that we don't have that. Finally, weeds impact cultural practices and crop performance. So why is weed control important? Well, weeds have a tendency to compete with water and fertilizer, and those are two very, very valuable, important components that go into the production of our crops, or in the case of a landscape, into the growing of our ornamentals in the landscape. And oftentimes water is an expensive input, maybe not so much in Oklahoma or in Texas, but I also have Southern California as a part of my territory. And I can tell you that water is a very, very expensive input, and obviously fertilizer as well. So we don't want weeds to get in and rob us of those important inputs, or those precious commodities, both water and fertilizer. So why is weed control important? Well, it's all of these things, in particular, the costs that we have to incur with them. Second question I want to ask, and I'm just doing a few foundational things for everybody here so that you'll all understand a little bit of the basics of why we're talking about weeds today, is why is weed control so difficult? You know, why is it such a challenge? You know, this takes a few minutes to explain, but I think it's important for you to understand. As ornamental growers, whether it's in the nursery, whether it's in the greenhouse or out in the landscape, we have lots of crop diversity. You know, I jokingly tell people we're growing everything from petunias to palm trees and everything in between. There's just a lot of different genetic diversity, as well as just different types of crops. We have perennials, we have annuals, we have woody plants, we have ground covers, we have shrubs, trees, annuals. You know, it goes on and on, herbaceous perennials. And on top of that, we just have lots of genetic diversity. Tens of thousands of cultivars are being produced, whether it's different colors of different annuals, or whether it's different types of azaleas, rhododendrons, maple trees. You know, you guys all know, it's a long list. The other thing that we do in our industry, especially in the nursery and the greenhouse, is that we're planting crops on a year-round basis. So unlike farmers who might be growing a single crop like corn or soybeans or wheat, they go out at a pretty defined period of time each year. So they encounter a certain specific type of seasonal weeds during that planting period. Those of us in the nursery, greenhouse, and in the ornamentals business, we're encountering weeds throughout the year, because we might be planting not only in the spring, but maybe in the summer and the fall as well, even during dormant times. We also happen to have a relatively small number of acres. You know, when companies like Bayer are developing new chemistries in the marketplace, we tend to think about not just thousands of acres, but we tend to think about millions of acres. If you just to give you an example, here in the United States, we plant about 100 million acres. 100 million acres. Get your head around that, of corn every year. About 60 million acres of soybeans, and maybe 50 million acres of wheat. There's a lot of acres of those crops. So if we can develop a specific herbicide that addresses important weed problems for those really gigantic acreage crops, we can make a lot of money. You know, you can imagine that Bayer, BASF, Syngenta, Corteva, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to develop a specific herbicide for a very specific crop. Like our ornamentals crops. I mean, we're really in the ornamentals business dealing with tens of thousands of acres, maybe 100,000 or so acres across the entire US. So you can see that our markets, although very valuable, it's relatively small. So thank goodness that we have a program like the USDA's IR4 program. That's a program that allows funding that comes from the USDA for companies like Bayer to provide funding to researchers to research our herbicide products that maybe are registered for larger acreage crops to be tested on smaller acreage crops, like ornamentals, like forestry crops, like maybe some fruits and vegetable crops that have much smaller acreages, but have a need for pre-emergence weed control. So the USDA's IR4 program is a very valuable asset that allows us to get products tested onto relatively small acreages, and then allows us to go to the EPA and get registrations. Despite all of that, we really have a very limited number of effective herbicides that we have available to us on the ornamentals side of the industry. And I love this slide because it really tells a very important story for those of you that might be wondering, why aren't there a lot more products for us to use? Why do we have such a limited number? The list here is 12 different active ingredients listed there on the left-hand side. The middle column has the year in which the EPA provided the initial registration of those chemistries. And then on the right-hand side is kind of a list of some of the different products that you'll find those active ingredients in. And what you're going to find over there on the right is virtually, I'd say 90 to 95% of all of the pre-emergence herbicides that we use in the ornamentals and in the landscape industry. But what you see is a very limited number of active ingredients. And if you start looking at the different types of modes of action that are there in the parentheses, we have even fewer number of types of active ingredients available to us. And look at trifluralin. That's Treflan, that was introduced back in 1959. That's 60 years ago. We have products that we've been using in the ornamentals industry for over 60 years. Look back at the last two there, dimethenamide P, which is an active ingredient found in Tower and Freehand. I happen to be working for BASF at the time we launched Freehand, so I'm quite familiar with that. And then indaziflam, that's active ingredient that's in a couple of Bayer's products, Marengo, and those of you on the landscape side will know this as Spectacle. Look at the dates that those were introduced. We've only had 2 active ingredients that have come into our industry, in the ornamentals industry, in the last 20 years. Go back to dithiopyr, which is dimension, and you got 30 years ago that we've only had 3 new active ingredients. So the point of the slide is to show you, we don't get many new active ingredients in our industry. And when we do get them, we really need to steward them carefully. We need to make sure we are rotating chemistries properly, that we just don't lock on to one type of mode of action or one type of active ingredient and use it over and over and over again. But we need to be careful with what we have. So the point is that we have very limited numbers of options. And that's one of the reasons why we have some challenges with weed control, because we just don't have a whole lot of chemistries at our disposal. The other thing that we do in our industry, and we're the most generous people in the world, is that whenever we have a problem in our industry, we tend to ship it all over the place. So when a new weed comes into, let's say, South Florida, they start growing crops, they start shipping liners all around. Guess where it goes? It goes to everybody. And so what was Florida's problem, and I don't mean to blame them in particular because it happens on both coasts, whenever these new weeds come in from overseas, for example, and let's face it, they do come in all over the world now. We're shipping plant materials from all over the world these days. It's not unlikely that we, within a few years, will find these weeds shipped throughout our industry in the United States. So we have new weeds that we have to control, and we constantly have to be looking at different ways of controlling them. Another thing that we encounter in our industry is population shifts. Some of these are seasonal shifts. We have some problems that exist in the spring that are different than the fall, that are different in the winter, let's say, or in the summer. However, we also have populations that shift in different parts of the U.S. What might have been a problem for growers in Oklahoma 30 years ago because of weed control products and practices may not be a problem anymore, but that might have opened up a void where maybe a new weed has come in and taken root, so to speak, and become a problem for us. So you can never sit still. That's the bottom line. You're always having to deal with new weeds coming in, whether they're old weeds or whether they're new types of weeds. We're going to be challenged with that throughout our career. I guess what I tell people is I've got great job security because we're always going to have new problems when it comes to controlling weeds. Now, here's another principle that I think you all need to kind of get your arms around, is the fact that selective weed control isn't easy. Essentially, what we're doing is killing weeds or killing plants in plants. You know, we've got weeds growing with ornamentals. We want to keep the good guys happy, right? We don't want to harm the ornamentals. We want to take out the bad guys, that's the weeds. But a lot of the genetic diversity is such today that what used to be considered a weed is now a beautiful herbaceous ornamental of some sort. And so the genetic diversity between weeds and crops happens to be narrowing a little bit. And it makes it a lot harder for us to go in with broad spectrum herbicides, expect to keep the ornamental plants very safe, but at the same time deal with controlling a broad spectrum of weeds that we have to control, both broadleaf as well as grassy. Now, I'll come back to this topic in a little while because I think it's an important one that we need to talk about when we're setting up a weed management program, because we really have to understand what it is we're growing as an ornamental in order to select the best type of pre-emergence herbicide to give us good weed control. Now, here's another thing, and I'm going to say that in Oklahoma, I run across a lot of great growers. And so I know that you're doing a great job for creating an ideal environment for your crops to grow or your ornamentals in the landscape to grow. But guess what? That's the opportunity for a weed to grow too. Weeds really like the environment that we create for growing our plants. So I tell you this, if you can grow a nice plant, chances are you can grow a nice weed too. These are all reasons why weed control is a challenge. And it's why it's a constant effort on our part to get our arms around weed control and having a nice uniform process. Just a little bit of history here. And while I have been in this industry for, I hate to say it at this point, but I've been in it over 40 years as a grower and in the chemical side of the business. But I don't go quite this far back as a grower, at least. Back in the 50s and 60s, weed control was very simple in the nursery industry and in the ornamentals. If you saw a weed, you pulled a weed. It was as simple as that. There weren't any chemicals. So it was all hand labor. You either had a hoe or you had a hand, and you had to get down and eliminate that weed physically. Then in the 70s and 80s, and I started in the industry back in the very late 70s, working for a large container grower. And this was the advent of chemical control. And so this is when some herbicides, pre-emergent preventive herbicides, came into the market in the ornamentals industry. And you can see some of these names, some you might be familiar with. Ronstar, which is still around. That's a Bayer product, by the way. We've been selling Ronstar for many years. It's still effective. Treflan, Pendulum 2G, OH2, Route, Snapshot, those all came into the industry sort of during that time period of the 70s and 80s. And the reason that they gained a lot of interest and a lot of use amongst growers is because they did a great job on a lot of the key weeds that growers encounter. Spurge, bittercress, chickweed, oxalis, crabgrass. Some of these are still weeds you deal with today. And these products did a great job on those. Now, one of the challenges with these products was that they were fairly short-lived. A lot of them would last 6 weeks to 2 months at the most. But that was enough. That was a lot better than hand weeding, and we had to at least go out and make repeated applications through the course of the year. But the bottom line was that we had some tools at our disposal to help us to prevent weeds and to limit the amount of hand labor that we had to use to control them. Fast forward to the 90s up to the present, and we've had some new and emerging weeds that have come into the industry. And now we see a much broader spectrum of different types of both grassy and in particular broadleaf weeds, such as eclipta, willow herb, liverwort, nodding spurge, a whole host of spurges actually, common groundsel. We deal with this one out on the West Coast a lot, and yellow nutsedge. All of these weeds have become more prominent along with some of those old basic weeds. And it's required us to try to find some new solutions to those problems. Consequently, the chemical companies have come to the forefront with some new products. SureGuard and Broadstar back in the late 80s, Freehand in the 90s, and Tower also from BASF back in the 90s. And then more recently, Marengo and Marengo G, all new products that have come to offer solutions in addition to those products that I mentioned earlier. Well, at the end of the day, your successful weed control program is going to be a comprehensive approach. You're not just going to be able to go out and select one herbicide off the shelf and it's going to be a solution to every situation you run into. You're also going to employ some different strategies in terms of doing a little bit of hand weeding. You're going to be trying to time herbicides with different types of weeds at different seasons of the year. You're going to have to pay attention to the crops you're growing because herbaceous perennials might require a different type of approach with pre-emergent herbicide control than maybe woody plants like junipers or hollies or trees might have. And also your environment's going to be different. You know, Oklahoma's weed problems are a lot different than what we encounter in Southern California or up in the Pacific Northwest, for example. So you need to select a comprehensive approach, and I'll address some of this a little towards the end and try to give you some thoughts on weed control strategies and programs specifically for Oklahoma, but we'll talk about those in just a bit. What I want to talk about next are 3 key strategies that you can use, anybody can use in the greenhouse and in the nursery in terms of managing and controlling weeds before they get a foothold in your plant materials. I want to speak specifically to the nurseries a little bit here first. First of all, that upper left-hand picture you see is a propagation house. And what do we see there? You know, we see a whole host of weeds growing not only at the edge of the wall there, but we also, if you look closely there, you can actually see weeds coming up through the grow mat. And that lower left-hand picture, we're out in the field here in a container nursery operation, and we can see weeds coming up through the gravel beds. So we know that if we get at the weeds at the source, and I'm going to tell you right now, if you've been sleeping up until now, I understand. If you're going to sleep afterward, I understand. But listen to me and stay awake right now, because this is the important stuff. If you can control your weeds at the source, you will have outstanding weed control overall. It is a principle to having good weed control is getting at these weeds at the source. So back to that picture in the upper left-hand corner, we don't want our weeds to go to seed and have those seed find their way into our liners, for example, if they're inside an enclosed structure. We don't want those weeds to go to seed out in the field and to launch their seed. That happens to be a bitter cress, which has the ability to project the weeds up to 3 to 6 feet away from the source. So we don't want those weed seed to find their way into our containers while we're trying to grow our plant materials in production. So one of the strategies we use is to go in and control those weeds at the source. And you know, we happen to have a product named Marengo. Marengo can actually be used inside enclosed structures like greenhouses. So we can actually make an application in an enclosed structure with that. We can go out and make an application with Marengo on gravel. And there's a picture there that I've just posted on the right-hand side of someone that's employing that strategy. After they clear out an area of the nursery, a section of the nursery, maybe they've shipped off some plants, they come out and regrade the area, get everything reset, get the irrigation reset, and then they come in and make a treatment with Marengo right over the top of the gravel. And then they irrigate it in or allow the rainfall to move it down into the soil profile so it controls the weeds at the source. When you have a clean nursery environment like this, where you have the weeds controlled at the source, it eliminates so much more of the problem that you're going to have in the future in your containers. So I just want to make a point again that controlling weeds at the source, using bed prep as a strategy is a great strategy. Costs a little bit more, but the amount that it saves you in labor later in hand weed control is more than offsets the cost. All right, what's the next strategy in mind? The next strategy is using directed sprays of liquid pre-emergence herbicide. And I really have the yin and the yang here in these 2 pictures. On the left is a very sophisticated drop nozzle spray rig. This is out on the West Coast. This is a nursery that has thousands of acres of budded trees. And they use a rig, I actually have a couple of rigs like this that they use. And they make applications of their pre-emergent herbicides during the winter when the trees are dormant, when the plant materials are dormant. And they can make a directed spray right at the base of those plant materials before the plant materials begin to grow in the spring. So they're making this, oh, I would say February, March, something like that, before plant materials start to, buds start to swell and they start to push spring growth. On the right-hand side, you have what is the opposite of that spray rig, which is a backpack sprayer. Your male model there happens to be myself. I was putting out a treatment, a research treatment on some field-grown roses. And again, I'm being very careful not to spray the roses, but making a directed spray right down that bed. And that strategy has worked well, and that particular grower has begun to employ that on hundreds of acres of his roses now, very successfully. But the key here is I'm making a directed spray, and you can do that on some large container-grown trees. You can do it mostly on field-grown nursery stock, but it's a great strategy to continue to consider using. Finally, the last strategy is over the top. And most of the over-the-top treatments that we deal with in the nursery today are oftentimes done with granular pre-emergence herbicides. Granular pre-emergence herbicides are easy to put out with a broadcast spreader like you see there on the left. You can walk up and down the rows fairly easily. In this particular case, on that left-handed picture that you see there, that we're actually calibrating the rate of the herbicide using some calibration trays before we go out. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is for you to consider doing good calibration and making sure that you're getting the right rate evenly over the plant materials and over the surface of the soil as a strategic, important effort that needs to be made before you go out and start treating plants. But take a look at those pictures on the right. Those are some nurseries that are using some of the granular pre-emergent herbicides that I've represented over the years. And look what a great job they're doing in getting those herbicides out evenly, uniformly, and you can see the results. Excellent weed control in those circumstances. So again, strategy of controlling at the source on your ground beds, using a strategy on certain plant materials of using directed sprays of liquid herbicides, and then finally using registered granular treatments over the top with container-grown ornamentals. By the way, I would add that with container-grown ornamentals, there are more and more nurseries using liquid sprays. There's just not as many of the liquid pre-emergent herbicides that are labeled for over-the-top uses, but there are some. And the biggest challenge, as you can see with both of these nurseries, is just that you've got very wide beds. It's hard to get a piece of equipment that can reach all the way halfway across those beds to make those boom spray applications. But there's more and more nurseries that are figuring it out and then doing it. And if you have a nursery that's set up for doing that, you might consider using liquid applications as well. All right, let's keep moving along. I wanted to touch briefly on management costs and the difference, and really what I really want to highlight with this slide without going through all of the different products in particulars is that in general, liquid treatments tend to be less expensive than granular treatments on a per acre basis. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, just formulating granular pre-emergent herbicides is expensive. When you take the active ingredient, formulate it onto a granule, and use that as a treatment option, it's going to be more expensive. Second thing is it's a bit more expensive to apply granular treatments because you're having to use a belly grinder. You can only treat minimal areas at a time, so you've got more labor involved in the application process with granules than you do with liquids. But in general, liquids are a bit cheaper. Now, in the case of Marengo, our product, when you put out a high rate of the granular product, you're actually putting out less active ingredients than you do with the high rate of our liquid. It's just a difference in the way our labels have been written. So consequently, your length of control is a little bit less with granules than it is with liquids in the case of Marengo. I'll touch on that in just a second. But there's just some differences with liquids and granular treatments. I just wanted you to understand those differences. One other point I would make with liquid treatments is that I really like liquid treatments where you can use them because it allows you to buy your components separately and you can mix and match things. Also with liquid treatments, if you're doing bare ground treatments, for example, under box or container trees, or if you're doing bed prep type treatments, you can mix in a post-emergence herbicide like glyphosate or glufosinate with your pre-emergent herbicide, sort of kill two birds in one stone. If you have emerged weeds, you can take those out at the same time you're putting your pre-emergence herbicide down. All right, hopefully that wasn't too complicated. I kind of ran through that quickly, but I think I made my point. Here's your biggest cost. The biggest cost is the cost of neglect. And that's for you growers that either get too busy or you forget or you push your treatment back, or for whatever reason, you don't want to end up like that picture on the right-hand side. That is not a crop. Well, it is a crop. It's a crop of weeds. They're actually trying to selectively remove those weeds because they happen to need those liners for a production demand. But you don't want to get yourself in a situation where you're having to hand weed. Hand weeding, if you were just to rely on hand weeding, studies show us that those costs run between $4,000 and $5,000 per acre per year. That's a substantial labor cost that we can avoid by and large with the use of pre-emergence herbicides. But I want to tell you, pre-emergence herbicides aren't perfect. There isn't a perfect product out there. You're never going to get it on perfectly. It's never going to work perfectly. There's all kinds of different factors that can limit the how a pre-emergence herbicide might work. However, they're 95, 98% effective. But what I suggest you do is you build in a routine, maybe a 2-week routine like you see in the left-hand picture there, where at the end of the day, when everybody's wrapping up some of their tasks, you have the crew go out and walk through the field, rogue out any emerging weeds that you might have missed with your pre-emergence application, and you get those weeds out before they get a foothold. If you do that every other week, there's not a whole lot of hand weeding that has to be done. However, you will get those weeds that might, in fact, emerge, set seed, and cause you some problems on down the road. So a limited amount of hand weeding along with a regimen of pre-emergence herbicides really makes for the ideal strategy for getting weed control. But neglecting weed control, especially pre-emergence applications, and you end up with a situation like you see there on the right. All right, so I've given you a lot of info. Let's start to collate some of that information and process it into making an informed choice. First thing I'd like to say, as someone that's I've worked for a number of companies that have, and I work for the Scott's company, I work for BASF, currently work for Bayer. We sold pre-emergence herbicides. They all worked. All of those herbicides worked, but all of them have limitations. If applied according to their label, they mostly work as they claim that they'll work. They need to be put out properly, obviously at the right time of the year, uniformly at the right rate. However, that said, the weed species that are controlled, the seasonal considerations, issues regarding crop or plant safety, the costs of application, and the length of control do vary from product to product. One product may control broadleaves better than another product. One may control certain grassy weed species better than others. All of them have differences with regards of plant safety and crop safety. And their labels usually spell those things out. But keep in mind, so I go back to my statement from earlier, we're trying to kill plants in plants. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And we must always weigh the risks of plant tolerance versus plant injury. That's kind of what I call dancing on the razor's edge all the time. Growers are trying to put a herbicide out that won't injure the plant that you're growing, but that it allow that to tolerate the herbicide while it gives us decent weed control. And sometimes you may encounter a little plant injury. And the question is can I tolerate a little bit of plant injury? You know, when I first put a herbicide out, I know I'm going to get good weed control, but it turns some of my crop a little bit yellow for a few weeks. Well, that might be some tolerance that you're willing to endure, as opposed to not putting out a herbicide or putting out a less effective herbicide and having to come in and hand weed it later. Those are risks that you as growers and users have to be willing to endure. Now, one thing you need to do is if you have a question about crop tolerance with a herbicide, is contact the manufacturer's rep. Give me a call. I'll help you out. I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you if it's, you know, hey, we've had experience with that. Or if I don't know the answer, I've got people that I can ask. Another thing you need to remember is that don't forget to include your costs of application when you're making your informed choice. If you're putting out the herbicides with a hand-applied granular applicator, broadcast spreader, the so-called belly grinders I referred to it earlier, you're going to have to add costs of about $50 per acre in order to do that, just labor costs alone. But here's a factor that I think really separates products, and that's the performance of length of control. Different products will last different lengths of time. And there's two things that influence the length of control of a pre-emergence herbicide. One is just the product itself. Different chemistries behave differently in the soil. Different chemistries last different lengths of time. Secondly is rate. Some products, like a product like determine how long it lasts. You know, the higher the rate that we use, the longer it lasts. The formulation that you use might influence the longevity. We know that the granular rate of Marengo at the high rate lasts not quite as long as the liquid rate at the high rate of Marengo. But you need to use longevity in your calculation to determine costs so that you understand how much you're spending on a per month of control. And that's one of the things that I ask you as you're making your informed decision that you calculate. What's my cost per month of control? Yeah, Marengo might cost a lot on the front end, or SureGuard might cost more on the front end, or Freehand might cost more on the front end. But how long is it lasting? And how long does that length of control give me and really reduce my cost per month of control, and in fact actually be a competitive, not a cheaper option? I love this picture on the left. This was a picture taken from a couple of years ago. I approached a large container grower. This guy literally grows over 1,000 acres of container grown box trees like this. And they grow them all on native soil, no gravel, no anything, but they put down a pre-emergence herbicide. And I challenged him to try Marengo on this particular growing yard. So they did. They went out and made an application in October. This picture was taken in May. And if you know anything about Southern California, all of their rain falls between Thanksgiving and Easter, more or less. They get almost all of their rain during the winter months. Consequently, it's their most challenging time of the year for weed control. So after 7 months, they were still getting very good weed control. In fact, this lasted about 8 months with the single application. And he was convinced. He's gone into using this throughout their nursery operation. But I just want to make a selfish plug here for Marengo in that it's a broad spectrum product in that it controls a wide range of grasses, broadleaves, in particular, a lot of the tougher weeds. I've worked with a lot of herbicides over the years. Back into the late 70s, this is without question the longest lasting pre-emergence herbicide I've ever dealt with. And it has a very good safety profile on woody ornamentals. It's ideal for rotation because Marengo has a unique mode of action that's not found in any other pre-emergence herbicides. Therefore, you can rotate it with virtually any of the other pre-emergents for good stewardship. So enough of the shameless plug there. I needed to talk about my product just for a second. Let's talk a little bit about a strategy. What could we do in a nursery and landscape, since those two particular markets are very similar in terms of their strategies? Let's talk a little bit about field-grown nursery stock. So if I'm king for a day and you ask me what you should do, here's what I'm going to tell you. I would make an application during the dormant time of the year. That could be as late as February, March. I would think, the March timeframe might be best in the Oklahoma market. Certainly before you start to see bud swell in trees and shrubs. And I'm going to go out at the high rate and I'm going to make a directed spray. And that directed spray is going to give me 7 to 8 months of weed control. So that when you come around to sometime later in the summer, July, August, I'm going to have to make another application to give me a window of pre-emergence control during the fall months. So I'm going to make that application. I'm going to switch chemistries. I'm going to go to something like maybe tower plus pendulum, tower plus barricade. I might use gallery and dimension, might use SureGuard. You've got some great options to use there. Any one of those combinations or a single product like SureGuard would be great. That's going to take me up till about now, about this time of year when we're encountering a hard freeze And from now until my next application in the early spring, I'm going to let Mother Nature provide weed control. I'm going to let her give me that window of control during the winter months. So really, you're only having to make 2 apps. Now, if I'm going to be in a container nursery situation, and I'm going to use granular products, again, I like Marengo early because it gives me so much control during the spring, and I'm so busy during the spring, I don't want to have to mess with weed control. Get it out during the dormant season when you're not as busy. And then sometime earlier in the summer than maybe what I'm showing on this chart here, maybe in June, I'm going to come back with a treatment of granular pre-emergent. It could be Broadstar, it could be freehand, it could be a snapshot. And then I'm going to make another treatment going into the fall months. It could be OH2, could be route, could be something like that. And then again, once I get into the winter months, I'm gonna feel pretty comfortable that the winter is going to give me some weed control. So on a liquid spray program, we're looking at possibly 2 treatments. On a granular application in a container nursery, we're probably looking at 3. But that ought to give you a nice window of keeping the kind of the weed germination, that window closed throughout the growing season. Last thing I want to talk about quickly here are greenhouses. You have very few options in the greenhouse. Unfortunately, there's only one product labeled for use in greenhouses for pre-emergent control, and that's Marengo Flowable. It can be used on graveled areas in greenhouses, and it can be used sprayed under benches. You also can make the application when plants are present, though I would suggest you probably be very careful. You want to make sure you're not getting any drift. You probably want to make those treatments early in the day, late in the evening when your fans are not running. But ideally, if you're spraying it on the ground, you might wait till the greenhouse gets cleared out and you spray the gravel. But again, on graveled areas that have existing weeds, you can mix it with a broad spectrum post-emergence herbicide, again, like glyphosate or glufosinate. I'm going to challenge you to read the labels because the labels are a little different on some of the post-emergent herbicides in greenhouses. But I've explained, I think, what Marengo can and can't be done with in greenhouse uses. All right, so here's what happens to you. Well, let me wrap up with just one quick closing comment here, and then Summer will be ready for some Q&A before too long. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize is that a pre-emergence program can work effectively no matter what your circumstance, whether you're a field grower, you're growing big trees in containers, you're a container grower, you're in a shade house, maybe some of your non-production areas, your roadways, the areas around greenhouse and overwintering structures, fence rows around buildings. Weed control, preventive weed control can be performed in all of these areas, and you really should employ a strategy to do so. If not, you look like this. This is a guy that chose not to use Marengo. This is what happens. Seriously. No, not really. That's an old picture from an Ohio tomato grower that did not innovate. So innovate. Change when the market changes. All right, so with that, let me post up my my contact info. There's my mobile number. There's my email address. We'll leave those up here for a second so that you can jot those down. Text me, call me, email me, send smoke signals, whatever it takes. I will come to my house. I'll answer your questions. I'm happy to do so and to help you with your weed control issues. All right, Summer, I need to take a drink of water here. What do we got on questions here? I saw that you popped something up here earlier. I saw that there was a question. Do I need to stop sharing? Would that be the best thing for me to do? I saw a question pop up, so let me stop sharing. And I do see a question here.
All right, we do. We have one question so far.
And this is coming from one of your distributors, Jeff Campbell. Hey, Jeff. You might let everyone know that we distribution being told that Surfland Horizon no longer available and probably won't be available again. Yeah, what's happening is the manufacturer of that active ingredient has made a decision to stop manufacturing Surfland. And so, yeah, that will go away here. So that's going to affect, let's see, it's going to affect Route. Route will go away as a granular and Surfland will go away as a sprayable option. Got lots of other options available though. Anybody else have a question? And I don't know if you open up their mics or not, but I don't have a problem as long as somebody's not out mowing the lawn. We've got a house full of dogs and cats.
All right, we've got our next question.
Best control for nut sedge. Don't get nut sedge. No, just kidding. Best control for nut sedge. So both Marengo and Tower, which is also a component in freehand, will control germinating yellow nut sedge seed, okay? But if you have the propagules, the nutlets, which is how most of the nut sedges propagate, unfortunately, neither one of those will control those. The only post-emergent that I know that is effective is Basagran. Basagran does have some some ornamentals on the label, and so you can use it around some ornamentals, but I can't speak to all ornamentals on that. Outside of that, you've got some real challenges because that's a great example of a weed that's kind of come to the forefront in our market because we irrigate a lot, and the sedges love a lot of water. And so managing your water, I guess, would be one suggestion, but really in most nursery situations, we're having to add water, and it's a very, very challenging one. So I don't know if that helps you, but as a post-emergent, take a look at Basagran. It's an effective product. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that, but that would be my suggestion. Let's see, is that the same question? Yeah, you just posted that one up. All right. Well, Summer, that's, you know, they're tired of looking at that reflection off my bald head.
No. You know, it takes a couple minutes for everybody to type. So does anybody else have any questions?
I left my phone in the other room. I don't even know. Hopefully I'm not running overtime today.
No, you're doing great.
Okay, good.
All right.
I know that I know. Let me just end on one thing quickly.
Absolutely.
Is that I would suggest that if you do encounter some weed problems that you have, don't hesitate to take some good pictures. You know, digital photography has been just a godsend in our industry, and most all of you have access to a smartphone. And if you take a little time to take a picture with your smartphone, make sure you get a good solid close-up picture. Don't get your shadow in the way, and take a couple of pictures and select one or two and send them out. You'd be surprised, more times than not, we can provide you with a fairly accurate ID of the weed, and that goes a long way towards helping to make a recommendation in terms of what can and what cannot be used as a pre-emergent.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Your information was very insightful, and we really appreciate you.
Glad to be a part, and best of luck to everyone. Happy holidays coming up. We have a lot to be thankful for in this country. Let's don't focus on the negative stuff. We've got a lot to be thankful for. We should all be looking forward to the holidays and maybe kicking our feet up and spending some time with your family. So I hope you are all able to do that. As soon as I can, I'm looking forward to getting out and seeing you face to face, but let's get through this. Let's get through this pandemic, and we'll all be better on the other side. Don't hesitate to reach out though and contact me with your questions.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thanks for joining us on ONLA Webinars. We'll catch you next time.